Hello and welcome to another episode of App Stories. Today's episode is brought to you by Claude from Anthropic. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is Federico Fetici. Hey, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm doing all right. We're sitting here on the cusp of things coming out. By the time this episode comes out, Apple will have probably released a bunch of things, but that's not that's not the topic for today. The topic for today is imagining an AI-driven Apple. And I was thinking about this the other day because I think that when we talk about Apple and AI, we are kind of all fixated on Apple Intelligence and when smarter Siri is coming. But what else could there be? And I'm starting to get the feeling like, well, this Siri thing has taken so long that by the time Siri finally gets out the door, whether it works or not, it's going to feel behind. It's going to feel like Apple's behind still because the world will have passed it by in terms of AI. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit today about what are the kind of things that we think Apple could do in a very Apple-y way with artificial intelligence that we would like to see them do.
So there's the tension between what we would like to see them do versus what they're most likely going to do.
Yeah, there is. And I think, it's probably worth starting out by just saying that I think that you and I both come at it from a perspective of automation and productivity more so than any kind of replacement for creativity or art or anything like that. I mean,
we should say that up front that the two of us, we don't use AI. I don't think either of us is really big on image generation or video generation, which I actually find quite concerning myself.
I do too.
We don't use it for creative writing. We mostly have found, I think, the two of us, a sort of in some ways maybe a replacement for automation, but more of an additional tool. We treat AI as a tool, maybe a replacement for a traditional search engine. That's also an interesting conversation. What happens to web search when instead of finding links you're getting answers to your queries? That's an interesting conversation.
Right.
But I think yes, we should say upfront that although we are fully aware of the issues, I mean, we've been talking about this for a year and a half at this point, of the issues of AI actually replacing creative people. We've been trying to find ways to use AI in a non-creepy way and also in a non-sloppy and actually productive way, because that's also like you actually wrote about this recently, the idea of work slop that is sort of infecting the enterprise, and these employees spitting out reports written by ChatGPT or any of these tools really, and potentially adding to the time that is wasted for somebody else making sense of these reports. And I think we've been trying to find ways to actually tap into what is convenient about large language models in a way that is more conducive to work without replacing what we do, because I think what's important is that we like what we do. Like, I like the grind. I like the process of writing. I don't want AI to replace that for me. And so that's sort of our angle. And then when it comes to Apple, it's an interesting problem because they're obviously behind. If your metric is like, does Apple have a modern LLM? Like, okay, they're behind. But there's maybe a little bit more to that. There's maybe a little bit more context, especially given Apple's role as a platform holder that is different compared to, say, what OpenAI or Perplexity or Claude, even for that matter. I mean, they're the sponsor of this episode, but we're just analyzing this landscape right now. And so I think Apple is in a very interesting position, to say the least.
Right. No, I agree. And the thing, I mean, I did write about work slop recently because I found it to be one of those things that fit in neatly with kind of the point of view that we've had with productivity and AI, which is, work slop is essentially creating a report, something like a presentation or a report or something, a memo that looks polished on the surface, but is not but actually creates more work for somebody else because it's not.
And doesn't really hold up under scrutiny by an expert.
Exactly. So that's kind of that angle of it. And then, as you said, I don't think it's a replacement for automation. I do think I consider like AI a component of automation. It's the kind of thing that in some instances, sure, you can replace some sort of automation you maybe did with shortcuts with AI, but oftentimes it works better in combination with other systems. And one terminology that gets thrown around a lot in the world of AI is deterministic versus non-deterministic tools, right? And I think that gets mentioned a lot without a good explanation. And that probably is another good kind of preamble to the conversation, because things like writing code in Swift or writing a shortcut, those are deterministic historically, because you're telling a computer to do a series of steps. And sometimes there are certain things where those steps become very complex because the inputs are imprecise. And a lot of times it's things like, for instance, manipulating text. The whole reason regex is so hard and so complicated is that the English language, or any language, is so complicated that it required to boil that down into a set of ways to find certain words or phrases deterministically is very difficult. And AI actually cuts through all that and kind of eliminates the need for something like regex in a lot of circumstances, because it can use natural language. It can understand and predict what a sequence of words are going to be just based on the training data that was fed to them. So it's kind of the difference between following a recipe and maybe telling a story. It's kind of like a fuzzier type of thing.
Yeah. And even like this conversation about deterministic versus non-deterministic, even though it's still absolutely true in the sense that if you run a Python script or any kind of script really, or a shortcut, you know that the output is always going to be the same. Assuming all conditions are correct and that the input data is always in a consistent format, that script is going to have a deterministic output in the sense that it's always going to be the same. It's always going to, it gets mechanically processed, as you mentioned, and it's always going to look the same. Whereas by design, large language models are non-deterministic in the sense that there's not a strict set of rules that tells the LLM you should always produce these tokens when you're generating your response. And I'm oversimplifying here because there are actually ways to mitigate that and to make sure that there are different compression techniques and things that even Apple, for example, is doing with Apple Intelligence to force an LLM to always produce a specific type of output. There's a conversation about caching and compression and all that sort of stuff. But by and large, the large language model will generate responses that are always going to look slightly different from each other, right? Because it's non-deterministic. It's like if you ask me to tell you a story about my life, I'm going to tell the same story more or less, but every single time it's going to have, maybe a slightly different word, or it's going to be slightly longer or slightly shorter. That's because humans are also non-deterministic when they talk, unless you're actually reading a script. But this conversation also needs to be clarified, I think, in late 2025, because it's not as easy as it seems on the surface, in the sense that now, and this is also something I want to talk about when it comes to Apple, we have seen this rise of agents, right? We've been talking a lot about these agents. And what I think is interesting is that most of these agents that we're seeing these days are essentially traditional scripting and traditional automation scaffolding around LLMs. So these systems, Zapier, this new one that I've been using and really enjoy, and I want to talk about it at some point, Tasklet, from the makers of Shortwave. These are essentially systems where the LLM is quote unquote the brain at the center of it all, but the LLM, and especially these new models like Sonnet 4.5, for example, or GPT-5 even, that are really good at following instructions. These systems are told, when you reach this point, you got to run this bit of Python code, or you got to make this API call. And those systems, like at that point, is that really non-deterministic? Not really, because those systems are predictably, there's and you take a look at the latest benchmarks from Anthropic and OpenAI, they're saying, well, 97% of the time they follow those instructions. And then you'll be like, okay, but that 3%, and I agree with you. If we consider that 3% where the LLM is not following your instructions, then yes, they're still completely non-deterministic. But when they reach that point, they're running code, right? All those agents.
I agree. I think to me, I look at that as kind of like it's like a hybrid approach. What you're doing is you're mixing traditional deterministic systems like coding and scripting and all of that with these LLMs and using those things to create, as you said, a scaffolding, a framework, a way to force a certain output type or output within certain parameters that you wouldn't otherwise get if you were just like feeding it willy-nilly into a chatbot, for instance.
Yeah. And when it comes to Apple, you don't have to look far to see Apple actually taking advantage of this approach today, right now in iOS 26. You take a look at the use model action. That is a pretty perfect self-contained example of what we just talked about. That is an action that calls an LLM, whether it's the Apple Foundation model or GPT-5, and it's saying, you're going to use your natural language processing, but you are going to give me back data in this structured output format that needs to be deterministic. In the use model action, you can say, you got to give me text, or you got to give me a list, or you're going to give me a number, or a dictionary, or a Boolean value of true or false. Like you are combining the natural language capabilities of those systems with the more classic automation-driven approach, right? And so when I look at these agents today, I wonder, maybe something that Apple should consider, and I think they will. I can see a future where automations and shortcuts become little agents that you can run with large language models, like something that is always running in the background that can take data that is in a natural language format, or something that is non-deterministic by nature, like an email message or a document or something, and predictably run through those steps with shortcuts actions and produce a kind of expected output that you can, organize my reminders or reschedule my reminders or, draft a response to this message, like that sort of thing. I could see Apple turn automations into background agents of sorts. That I think is their opportunity here. One of their opportunities here, at least.
Yeah, I think it is too. To me, I think what's going to be very interesting is watching what the approach is going to be, because this is kind of where Smarter Siri comes into the mix, because Smarter Siri is using app intents in combination with the OS to take a bunch of different actions that have been donated by third-party developers and string them together in a way that the user wants, the traditional examples we saw at WWDC 2 years ago. And that to me is very interesting. I remain skeptical only because Siri is still not super great, and sometimes shortcuts is a little bit buggy, but if you can get over those humps, I think that there's a lot of potential there. What I do wonder about, though, is it enough if all of this sort of automation runs through the OS and there isn't as much opportunity necessarily to interface with third parties directly, whether it's app to app or app to web app using something like MCP. There's, the model, I think, for Smarter Siri is not, is a little limiting at this point, I think.
That is that's a complex conversation, and I think
know it is.
At a high level, I would split it into two buckets. The first one, I think, one of the reasons that people like using LLMs, 3 buckets. Make it 3 buckets.
Okay.
There's the fact that people, and I see this with Sylvia, for example, or my friends all the time, people just, despite what Apple thought years ago, people just like using chatbots. People just like having conversations, sort of to have like a partner for an idea, for a question, for any sort of doubt that they have. People just like having these long conversations, right? And especially with these latest models, that can provide detailed answers, people just like to do that. The second bucket is people increasingly are turning to these systems to replace web search. This is why Perplexity is so popular. This is why it was a big deal when OpenAI rolled out web search in ChatGPT and eventually Anthropic with Claude. And this is why Google is launching a full-blown AI mode in Google search, which I got to tell you, I got access to AI mode in Italy a few days ago. It's surprisingly good and fast and so much better than the AI snippets from Google search, like two completely different systems almost. Yeah. And the third bucket is app integrations. And we're seeing the beginning of this trend. We started seeing the beginning of this trend last year with MCP. Now, obviously, OpenAI with apps in ChatGPT is also realizing, well, after web search and after the fact that people like having conversations with ChatGPT, people are still using other apps. Like they're listening to music, they're listening to podcasts, they're reading the news, and they're keeping track of their habits, they're taking notes, all the things that people do with their apps. Right. And so these three buckets, traditional LLM, web search, and apps. This is how I'm looking at this problem. And I think short term, we're going to see Apple maybe provide a solution for the latter two and not the first one.
I think that's absolutely right. That's kind of where I was steering this, because that's where my head's been at. And if you think of it in terms of data, it's a lot easier to understand, right? The first wave was chatbots, and that's just working off of the training data that these systems were trained on. The second wave is search, and that's based on what's available on the web. The third is your personal information that's stored in all your apps, whether it's your contacts, your calendar, your email, all of that stuff. And that is it's not surprising. I mean, given where we've been over the last 20 plus years in technology and where data lives, and the fact that LLMs are all about manipulating and accessing data, it's not surprising that they've arrived at the doorstep of apps at this point.
And here's what I think. So the rumors are saying that Apple may launch a world knowledge capable Siri in 2026, but not a traditional like ChatGPT level Siri.
Right.
And here's why I believe that rumor. We have seen that if you have a really good search index, if you have a really good web search partner, you can use a not so powerful LLM to make sense of those web search results and provide an answer engine that people will still find convenient. And let me bring you some facts, John. Okay. Perplexity, they have a really good web search index. They actually launched the search API. They're rivaling Google from that point of view. There's also the likes of Brave Search that is also a partner for a lot of these systems. And there's also this up-and-coming startup called Exa, parentheses. I feel like Exa would be the classic Apple acquisition, but we'll see. I said it on the show, but we'll see.
Okay.
But in Perplexity, even when you use their free best model, that best model, you know what it is? It's a fine-tuned version of Llama 3.3. Mm-hmm. That is an open source model from last year that is still good enough when it comes to making sense of web search results. Because all it does, how these systems work, they fire off a little agent that opens in the background a bunch of web searches, opens those web searches, takes in all the text, and presents you the results. And turns out you don't need a GPT-5 level or a Gemini 2.5 Pro level LLM to make sense of those web search results. So most likely, I can see Apple roll out a slightly improved foundation model with web search integration to give you much better answers than Siri can today, because you're not actually relying on knowledge contained inside Siri. You don't have a world knowledge LLM. You have a small model that operates web search queries and results.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Claude from Anthropic. Claude is a next-generation AI assistant built by Anthropic and trained to be safe, accurate, and secure to help you do your best work. Of all the AI chatbots I've tried, Claude is my favorite because it's good at the small things that make a big difference. Things like following instructions, for instance, and its style of writing is fantastic too. But you can do a lot more than that kind of stuff. I've been using it to do all sorts of things. It's helped me build Python scripts. It's helped me move data from one format to another. And it's great for things like research. I use it all the time to find obscure websites about very specific topics and generate reports for me, complete with all the citations, so that I can go back to the source and read it for myself after reading the report. Claude is AI for minds that don't stop at good enough. It's the collaborator that actually understands your entire workflow and thinks with you, not for you. Whether you're debugging code at midnight or strategizing your next business move, Claude extends your thinking to tackle problems that matter. It doesn't just give you answers, it helps you think through the problem yourself. Claude's internal and external research capabilities go way deeper than basic web search. Think comprehensive, reliable analysis with proper citations for clients, turning hours of research into minutes. Claude can have context from your calendars, email, and all of your go-to tools. It's like having a central brain for all of your work. No more digging through multiple tools and documents. Ready to tackle bigger problems? Sign up for Claude today and get 50% off Claude Pro when you do by going to claude.ai/appstories. That's CLAUDE.ai/appstories right now for 50% off your first 3 months of Claude Pro. That includes access to all the features mentioned in today's episode. That's all lowercase letters, claude.ai/appstories. Our thanks to Claude for their support of the show. Interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think you're right. This kind of leads into something that I would like to see Apple do. I'd like to see them build a series of models that are tuned to their tools, right? I look at things that we've used like Shortwave and Notion AI, for instance, and it seems to me, especially Notion AI, to me, is the kind of thing that Apple should build for its own tools, replacing, for instance, help menus so that you have an agent that can show you how to do something in Final Cut Pro or how to make a smart list in Reminders. Something that not only can do it for you, but can also explain it to you in simple terms without having to do a bunch of web searches, which those are never easy, without having to go to a bunch of help documentation. But it goes kind of beyond that, because what if Apple built models that were also good for things like, I don't know, writing code, writing Swift code, building Swift UI interfaces, or even train it on what Shortcuts does, so that Shortcuts becomes a lot more frictionless for people who have never tried it. Say, I'm brand new to Shortcuts and I want to do this thing that would probably be 10 or 20 steps. And that's a hard place to start if you're brand new to Shortcuts. But with an agent by your side, you might be able to build that. And through that process, do a lot like what you've done over the years of teaching people, well, here are all the different building blocks that go into doing this step by step by step. And in that sense, it becomes a really good learning tool too.
It's funny you mentioned this because I think you inadvertently quoted a really popular paper from a few months back. Have you ever heard of the idea of SLMs, or small language models?
Oh, I have, yes.
So a few months ago, NVIDIA, of all companies, NVIDIA published this paper called Small Language Models Are the Future of Agentic AI. And I'm going to quote you from this. Here we lay out the position that small language models, SLMs, are sufficiently powerful, inherently more suitable, and necessarily more economical for many invocations in agentic systems, and are therefore the future of agentic AI. The idea being that if you are, at the end of the day, relying on a web search agent, again, it's a script, or app integrations.
Right.
This is basically what Apple announced last year with App Intents, right? If you think about it, it was a small model running on device that was still good enough, even though it was small and local, to handle those operations. Then the fact that they overpromised and didn't deliver is a separate conversation. But other companies are reaching the same conclusion, which is you don't need to have a giant model on your computer or in the cloud for that matter, to operate these agents. If all you want to do is build a better web search experience, or build a system that can assist you with writing code, or run API calls on the web, you probably don't need like a model trained on trillions and trillions of parameters and containing billions of parameters inside. Like you can just run a small model and train it in a way that can run an agent on the side. Most recently, I think last week, Samsung published another paper on this breakthrough of this really small model. I think like a 7 million model, incredibly small model and compressed model that through various modern techniques like compression and caching basically outperforms some of the smaller proprietary models from the rest of the industry.
Wow.
There are a lot of the industry, especially because of cost-saving measures, right? And the idea of running these systems locally on phones, they're sort of all reaching the same conclusion, which is, if you want to build an agent, you probably don't need to have something as giant as GPT-5, So I think Apple was actually, and this is potentially a hot take, I think Apple was actually on the right track with their idea last year. But then again, maybe their model actually wasn't good enough.
Right.
But I don't think the underlying concept was that misguided.
Right. No, I think that's a good point. That is, that it's very interesting because what you're talking about is building specialist models for particular tasks. And even a web agent is far bigger than what you would probably need to run all the apps on your phone. And this is, the benefit of a siloed environment that Apple has is that it has all these third-party apps and these intents that have been donated. That stuff's just there. It's a matter of putting the glue together to allow them to talk to each other.
Yeah. There are a couple of things that I want to mention before we wrap up this episode. The first one is that I think if Apple wants to be taken more seriously in this space, assuming that, like we mentioned, the 3 buckets, I think they have a pretty good shot at fulfilling, the 2 and 3. Right. They will need to have a chatbot at some point, and I think we're all in agreement that, turns out almost 1 billion people use ChatGPT on a weekly basis. Turns out the world has changed. People now like chatbots. There are many reasons for that. Eventually, Apple will need that sort of experience as well. But I think an AI-driven Apple will need in some way to conform to the rest of the industry, operate more quickly, more in the public, and sort of be more open when it comes to AI development. As we mentioned on AppStories every time we talked about this, things move so quickly in the AI space, it's really hard to keep up. Now, I'm not saying that Apple maybe will need to move as quickly as OpenAI or Anthropic or Google, but they will need to do something to be less of a black box as they are today. Where they once a year they publish their white paper on the foundation model. Maybe 3 times a year is. Is 3 times a year better? Yes, it's better than once a year. So they will need to iterate faster and more in the public eye, which I think will be interesting to see which person they will appoint as the new head of AI at Apple, replacing John Andrea. Well, according to Gurman, that's something that Apple is working on.
Right.
And the second is, I think we will continue seeing Apple iterate on their idea of a cloud model and a companion, smaller on-device model. Because I keep thinking, and the rest of the industry seems to agree, there is a lot of value to be taken out of this small on-device, private, low latency, which is also important, offline, small language models that can be more easily fine-tuned for data manipulation, for tool orchestration. So like if you're dealing with multiple app intents for multiple iOS apps,
right.
A small model that has been fine-tuned for that with no latency really comes in handy. And I think we may see some updates on this front pretty soon, even, with this upcoming wave of M5 devices.
Right.
Maybe that could be an opportunity for Apple to say, on these devices, our foundation model is even better.
Right.
Yeah, these are my two thoughts, but I think I don't think we're gonna. I mean, happy to be proven wrong, obviously. I don't think we're gonna have a Siri GPT in 2026, but I think we will have a web search experience and an app intents experience for sure.
How do you think the chatbot situation will play out with Apple? I tend to think that they will either build it into type to Siri, or build a separate chatbot app and open it up.
The second one.
And they'll open it up to third-party providers like Anthropic.
That I'm a little bit
AI.
more skeptical, because maybe in the short term, the problem is that once you commit to, so let's say that Apple launches a, chat application.
Yeah. That's probably what they call it.
Yeah. And at launch, it bakes in Gemini, ChatGPT, and Anthropic, because Apple doesn't have a large language model of their own. But maybe they will have a large language model of their own in 2027. And now they're on the hook for continuing to offer access to GPT, Claude, and Gemini, right?
Doesn't it become, though, a little bit like Safari, where you have your choice of search engine, where there's a default?
Yes, that's a good point. You're still gonna have to require people to sign up or sign in with an account. Like, I think Apple got burned a lot years ago when they offered the built-in social network integration in iOS for Facebook and Twitter. And they were so happy when they got rid of those.
Yeah.
I think institutionally, Apple is almost like institutionally averse to the idea of built-in hard-coded third-party integrations.
Yeah, I get it. The only thing is that they're a long way off to kind of competing, I think, toe to toe with any of those other companies.
You're also right. Right. So, I that is the $1 million question, right? Or $1 billion question. I don't know what they're gonna do there. There's an argument to be made that some Apple observers will say Apple is not behind on AI, because if you open the App Store, you're going to find, ChatGPT is the most downloaded app, and you can get Gemini, you can get Claude, and Claude integrates, and also Perplexity. They integrate with iOS. You're having a great experience on iOS with AI. And that is true to an extent, but boy, is it a half glass full approach. Like, yes, that is true. You can have a pretty solid AI experience on Apple devices thanks to third-party apps, but is Apple happy about that ultimately? Is my question.
Oh,
and I'm not sure.
I especially given that the trend with a lot of AI-driven apps is to the web, I think there's no way they're happy with that. As the proprietors of an app store.
So they have, I think realistically, they have a couple of short-term options that they can deploy. Web search, a much better Siri with web search, that I can totally see, and MCP, app intents, like all that sort of stuff. Pretty good way, I think, to sort of underline the aspect of, hey, now you can work with your favorite apps with an LLM.
Here's an alternative path they could take. Instead of like a standalone chatbot, would be, since the courts have allowed Google and Apple to continue their relationship on search, you could build Gemini into the sidebar of Safari, for instance, and have a chat baked in, very similar to what Google's doing with Chrome.
Yeah,
maybe. I don't know. I don't know that that's enough, given that people like standalone chatbots so much.
They could totally bake AI mode into the Safari address bar if they wanted to.
Yeah, they could. Or they could put it like, just do a right-hand sidebar to go along with the left-hand sidebar.
I'm sure Google would be happy to add another 10 billion to the pile, if,
exactly.
if AI mode is the exclusive AI answer partner. I don't know. We'll see. I do think realistically a proper ChatGPT but made by Apple is still a ways off. But there are things
Yeah,
that
I
Apple
agree.
can do between now and mid 2027 to sort of say we're still in this and we're shipping things. We don't have an LLM of our own, like a proper LLM, but we're gonna get there. It all comes down to messaging. It all comes down to the person they put in charge. There are still many things that, and I'm sure, Apple has been having these debates for months now since they delayed the App Intents integration.
Yeah. I think
Yeah.
between app intents and some sort of specialized small language models, that could go a long, long
Yes.
way. That could buy them a couple of years easy on a more generalized LLM,
Yeah, I
potentially.
think so. I agree, and I think that's realistically the approach that I think we're gonna see them take between now, WWDC 2026, and even 2027.
Yep, yep,
Yeah.
yep. Yeah. All right. All right. Well, good conversation, Federico. I appreciate
Yes.
it. It's I've been these are the kind of things that have been on my mind for a while. And you know what we're going to do in the post show? We're going to talk about the things that concern us a little bit
Yeah.
about
Some
what's
of
been
the
going on lately.
some of the
So
more insane things about AI.
yeah,
Yes.
exactly, exactly. Because it's this is very much a nuanced area right now of technology. But
Mm.
thanks again to everybody for listening today. Thanks to Claude by Anthropic for sponsoring this episode. Federico and I can be found at macstories.net and on social media where he is at Viticci. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHNVOORHEES. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.